Welcome to the Geek Cabal channel. My name is Bob, and today we're going to be talking about a book, The Greatest Show on Earth by Richard Dawkins. Now, number one, I put this off because I was trying to find my copy of it, which I apparently loaned to somebody and have not gotten back. So, I don't know where it is. So there'll be a picture approximately right over here as to what the cover of the book looks like. Hopefully. Of course, if I can't find one, then there won't be, and I'll just be waving my hands like a fool. But anyway, the book is about evolution. Now, I'm aware that for some people, this is a controversial topic, might be the best way to put it. I would say that if you have apprehensions about the concept, especially if they're from a religious standpoint, and I'm not gonna say, I'm not gonna judge one way or another on that. You should probably still read the book because it does walk through some of the finer points of the theory, so that even if you're someone who doesn't endorse the theory, it might give you a better insight into it to better know how to attack it if you so choose. But also, even in the opening, Dawkins tries to explain that he does try to attack at least one particular criticism, and that is that the theory of evolution does not address the origin of life. It's not meant to. It doesn't, like, flat out, like that's a non-starter. So that criticism is correct. It does not address where life came from, but it also doesn't claim to. And Dawkins, who's an atheist, even concedes in the beginning that maybe it was God snapping his fingers and saying let there be life. He's like, he doesn't personally believe that, but in the interest of intellectual honesty, he has to admit that sure, it's possible. So, bear that in mind before you judge if you do have religious reservations. And if you prefer not to read it, then hey, that is entirely your choice. I can't force you to read it, nor would I want to. So I don't know what you get out of the rest of this review. I mean, personally, I hope you keep watching, but since I'm going to be talking about the contents of the book, just figured I'd warn you up front, because not trying to persuade people here, other than, hey, you should probably check out the book, or at least I found it interesting, and if you find what I'm saying interesting, maybe you should check it out. So anyway, I just want to get that out of the way here, because I know, like I said, for some people it's a controversial topic. So anyway, I thought it was a good book, and there were a number of insights, explanations that I'd never really considered trying to use to explain evolution to somebody, and that I thought were interesting. And so I'll talk about a few of those here. One is that we don't actually need the fossil record to prove anything. We can do it pretty much all with genetics, showing that clearly certain species are related, they clearly had to have a common ancestor, and so on and so on. The fact that we have a fossil record, well, that's great, because that's easier to point to than, hey, you see this series of nucleotides? Well, it's just like this series of nucleotides. It's easier with bones because people can see them, they understand them. You don't need a PhD in genetics to understand this. However, there are obviously gaps in the fossil record, and that's a problem, mainly because some people only look at the fossil record and they have a huge misconception of things, like when they talk about the missing link as far as between humans and whatever primates we descended from. Now, according to evolution, we did not descend from apes or chimpanzees or anything like that. We have a common ancestor with some of them. At some point, there was a branching. Humans went one way, the other primates went the other way. So, there's not so much a missing link. And the best way to explain this is, I hope that anyone listening accepts the fact that dogs are descended from wolves. Like, we can 100% prove that with genetic testing. So, and apparently, a little side note, I was unaware of this. There was apparently a point in time where people thought that certain dog breeds were descended from certain other things, like jackals, apparently. Yeah, I don't know. News to me, but apparently that was the case. So anyway, so dogs are descended from wolves, okay? Now, if you were to take whatever wolves the first dog breeds came from, and you have them at one end, and then their progeny and their progeny, and so on, all the way down the line until you reach, what we're going to call a dog, not a specific breed, but, some generic looking dog. And you see all these animals stretched out, you will not be able to pinpoint the exact moment, the exact generation that this ceases to be a wolf and starts to become a dog. You'll notice over time that it's becoming less like a wolf and more like a dog, but you won't be able to say, aha, that one right there, that's the middle, that's the missing link in the chain, because the changes are gradual across thousands of generations, okay? And it would be the same thing with humans and whatever our ancestor was. We could have fossils of the so-called missing link and not even know it, because they look so much like one or the other, or maybe kind of in between, to the point that we can't distinguish between the two. There is no like single gap where it's like they were a primate, then they had a human offspring, or then they had like some half human offspring, and then humans. It's not a single generation mutation, okay? It's the accumulation of changes over time. And that's difficult to see, especially in an incomplete fossil record. So there is no missing link. That's a misnomer that people throw out there that don't understand anything about this. So don't fall for that. We'll never find the missing link because it doesn't exist. So that's one thing that was in there. Also, there was a side note about dogs, about how they probably evolved from wolves. Okay, before I go into this, there's a little thing that explained flight distance. That's how close a human being can get to an animal before it takes off. And essentially, human settlements would have had refuse piles, which would have had food in them. And wolves, like every other creature, are I'm going to say not advantageous. It'll come to me here in a second. I'll come back to it. They take the path of least resistance, and that's also a big thing I'm going to explain here in a second. So animals, they would come close to human settlements and try to raid the trash piles. The ones that could stick around longer because they knew the humans weren't going to attack them, or that they knew they could outrun the humans, whatever the case, they had a shorter flight distance. The humans could get closer to them before they take off running. Well, they would get more food, which would allow them to better take care of their offspring, who would in turn inherit that trait, and so on, and the cycle would continue until at some point the humans became accustomed to them, and the humans realized, hey, wait a minute, we can train these guys. And so in other words, dogs got like halfway there by themselves, and then humans took over with selective breeding. And that's how dogs came to be. and then lots and lots of other selective breeding, which unfortunately involved lots of inbreeding, to produce the many species of dogs that we have today, and or types. So that's the story of dogs. And you get a few other things like that, like their example of turtles, that we can tell by the way their form is that they began life on land, moved to the sea at some point, came back to land and back and forth a few times because of certain features they have and how far developed they are. And it's kind of interesting, that part. Though to me, the most interesting part of the book is an experiment that's ongoing involving bacteria, where they've charted successive generations of bacteria and how mutations have affected it, and you can literally see evolution in progress, where they would feed the bacteria and they would use certain colorations, and eventually mutation arose that, I think, if I'm recalling correctly, allowed them to actually process the dye as a food source, which made them even more efficient. And they've taken where the bacteria has split into different types, several times, and they're keeping all these lines alive. They take a sample and put it into a new jar and let it grow, and take a sample, put it in a new jar and let it grow. And then whenever they notice, certain changes, they'll split the samples to have them take off along different lines of evolution. And so you can literally see it in action. It's been going for years, and they've charted all kinds of changes in it. So for people that are like, oh, well, you can't even prove it because you can't see it in action. Well, yeah, you can. You just need something with this thing that reproduces a lot faster than humans do, like bacteria. So yes, in a way, you can see it. Now, I'm given to understand from something outside the book that there is actually some argument as to what the actual mechanisms are. Dawkins favors the gene theory, that clusters of genes are passed on and change and over time, and that's what drives evolutionary change. And obviously evolutionary pressure comes into things, which is why humans are mostly unchanged for the last several thousand years, because we're the top of the food chain. Like, there is no evolutionary pressure on humans, so there's no reason to change. And that's not a comment. This is not a comment from the book. It's a comment I picked up elsewhere, but this is important for the discussion of evolution. Despite what fiction would have you believe, evolution is not a series, is not moving towards a goal. It's moving away from a threat. Okay, the threat comes along. The things that survive the threat gain the ability to overcome the threat and proceed on and pass it on to their offspring. It's not moving towards like psychic powers or superpowers or anything like that. It's moving away from the things that threaten us, which, with our technology and everything at this point, are basically a handful of biological things. That's pretty much it. Like, there's no predators for us that we need to overcome or anything like that. We have the means to overcome all of them. So it's the way it is, which also affects our mating habits, because they're entirely self-selecting at this point. There's no evolutionary pressure to be like, oh, well, we need to find this in a mate or this in a mate. Now we're down to just instinct plus the conscious ability to override instinct, and or consuming lots of alcohol to make sketchy decisions. Whichever way you want to look at it. So, yeah. So then the other big thing in the book, and this applies to not just evolution, but this is like understanding how things in the world work kind of stuff right here. Evolution isn't a process that determines who's best at something. It determines if you're good enough at something. Okay? There's only so much, I don't want to say energy, but like there's only so many resources that can be devoted to a thing. Okay? So like a human body has a set amount of mass and limbs and energy generation and things like this. Okay? So there's no point in us having extra limbs they don't help in any way. So developing them just isn't going to happen. Okay, there's no evolutionary pressure to cause it to happen. Our eyesight is based on all kinds of bizarro things. Like there's all kinds of adaptations that had to happen for that to work. I don't remember the whole detail, but apparently like the images our brain processes like initially come in like upside down or backwards or something, and our brain has to actually like rearrange it so we can use it. And yeah, that's definitely a case of good enough versus just getting it right. You know, it works. It's good enough for us. We've gone to space. Clearly our vision is fine. We don't have the vision of a hawk because we don't need it. You know, there's no pressure saying we need that. Our vision is good enough. We can't see infrared or ultraviolet because we don't have a need to. So, you know, if a person were to be born with that ability, it's probably more of a hindrance than anything. But they're not going to that's not going to be some kickstart of evolutionary pressure for the rest of humanity. Like, oh, I have to have that. I've got to mate with this person so my kids will have that. Like, no, there's no purpose to it. So there's no, even though it's potentially superior vision, you know, doesn't matter. Just like, you know, people that do have, you know, 20/20 or beyond vision, like, that's great. And, you know, that is a sign of better genetics as far as vision, but you don't have to have that to get by in the day-to-day life. You haven't had to forever. You know, I mean, you know, being blind sucks, but people adapt. You know, and so these things, they're nice, but they're not 100% necessary for survival. Therefore, it's not a trait people necessarily look for when they're trying to, you know, when they're considered mates. And so, yeah, I mean, people are probably, you know, people are attracted to certain features, and like height for one, and good vision is one that people look for. But we also all know that, you know, glasses exist, like corrective, you know, laser correction exists, like these things exist. So it's not considered a handicap, even though it technically is. And so there's no drive for everyone to have absolutely perfect vision, and for those of us that don't, to just be cast off to the pages of history and our genetics forgotten. Like, that just doesn't happen, because this is good enough. And that's all evolution is. It's a race to be good enough. If you're good enough to do this thing, you're not going to devote any more time across the generations to perfecting it if you don't need to. So you're going to focus your energy someplace else, like, again, on height or metabolism, or the big one of the humans that probably should be focused on is brain power. You know, there are other things that you need to focus on, because you can't focus on all of them. You know, like, from an evolutionary perspective, creatures have to choose, usually subconsciously, or not at all. Like, you know, like the scorpion doesn't choose to, doesn't look for the mate with the most potent venom. Like, it doesn't consciously even know how to do that, you know. So, yeah, it's little things like that. But that's also how the real world works. Like, the VCR and the Betamax. The Betamax was the superior model, but the VCR was good enough. But it was also cheaper. It had the ability to spread, which, that's what biology is all about. When we talk about survival of the fittest, that's not the strong, whenever they talk about that, the strong surviving, it goes a little off topic here, but it involves evolution, so bear with me. They're not talking about it from what we hear from a social Darwinistic standpoint. What they mean is the ability to procreate and pass on your genes. You know, so the fittest are people that have lots of kids, because the odds of their genes surviving increase with each kid they've got out there to pass on their genes again and again. Okay? And so that comes down to having the resources to have kids, you know. So yeah, so that's what that's referring to. It's not talking about physical strength. Now, physical strength might attract a mate who's willing to have lots of kids with you, but that's not what that phrase means. And so whenever people talk about that from a standpoint of, I'm stronger, I'm going to survive this situation, that's social Darwinism. That's entirely different, and that's the kind of thinking that leads to really, really awful things like that were popular in Germany about a century ago. So, well, actually, they're popular more than just Germany. Just the Germans kind of took it to its conclusion. But anyway, the book, talks a lot about, just various examples and trying to explain how things have arisen, how certain animals have what are clearly vestigial organs, and why this kind of thing would happen. And yeah, but like I said, to me, the big thing was that experiment. That was really interesting to read about. So, yeah. So anyway, folks, in my opinion, you should check the book out. I think it's rather interesting. Really internalizing that whole good enough thing. So many things make more sense. Okay, as far as why we do the things we do in the world, why we as people act the way we act. I think we're pre-programmed to have that attitude. There's a handful of us that are perfectionists, and by that I'm not including myself in that. With a handful of things I am a perfectionist, but by and large no. I am very much of the, will this solve the problem? Could it be solved better, but it's going to take me 5 more hours? Yeah, then this is good enough. That's me. With a rare handful of exceptions. So that's just how things are, because again, that comes back to, and this is again an evolutionary thing, doing things expends energy. We are pre-programmed biologically to conserve energy, to not expend energy when we don't have to, because for the vast majority of our existence, and for the existence of almost every animal on this planet, energy comes from food, which is constantly under threat of not being there. So we have evolved from a state of famine. It is only since we developed this lovely thing called civilization that we've gone from famine being the norm to not quite famine, to our modern day, where for at least part of the planet we have plenty. And so we're still locked in that. Basically, we're programmed to be lazy. Okay, we have evolved to have the capacity to not be lazy with our physical, structure and everything, because we evolved to be able to hunt things like human beings can literally run other animals to death, for instance, and it's an advantage we have. So we have evolved to be able to do that because we had to, but we've also evolved to, when you put food in front of us, we're going to eat it, because we haven't overcome that famine thinking, that's programmed up here. And so that permeates everything else. If we don't have to do something, we don't want to do it, and that's a thing with humans. So, and that applies to other animals too. And again, if you understand all this stuff, a lot of other things about the world start to come into focus. And you really understand a lot about human behavior, even though it's all psychological. It evolved to be the way it is for a reason. So yeah, on that alone, I think you should check the book out. But anyway, that's just my opinion. I thought it's a great book. Gave me my warnings up front, my caveats. So I think you should check it out. There'll be links down in the description to buy it on Amazon if you so choose to help us, and if you're going to buy it, do it that way. If not, I still encourage you to check the book out at a library or however you can get a hold of it. But yeah, so like, share, subscribe. Let me know down in the comments, have you read this book before? Are you going to read it? Do you think evolution's all hokum? I'll take all the comments. But thank you folks for watching, and we'll see you later.